This is the story of the British ocean liner Britannic. Built and launched after the tragic loss of her sister ship, the famous Titanic, as one of the finest vessels of her era, the Britannic never crossed the Atlantic carrying the rich and the poor to the New World. During World War I, she was converted into a hospital ship and made 6 voyages into the Mediterranean, evacuating thousands of wounded soldiers from the eastern Mediterranean battlefields. Despite being considered more unsinkable than the Titanic, she was lost in only 55 minutes. At 10 a.m. on the morning of the 21st of June 1911, the White Star Line's brand new steamer RMS Olympic had just docked at Pier 59 in New York. With an overall length of 882 feet or 269 metres and at 45,324 gross tonnes, Olympic was ushering in a new age of transatlantic travel. 4 years earlier, it had all been so different, with Cunard's Lusitania and Mauretania taking the plaudits as both the largest and fastest passenger ships in the world. The White Star Line reputation for comfort and reliability was under immense pressure, and if they were not to be eclipsed, then the company had little option but to respond. It had taken almost 4 years, but the net result was that the Harland & Wolff shipyard at Belfast had been massively upgraded with 2 new giant slipways, and the Belfast Harbour Commissioners had constructed a new graving dock to accommodate the new generation of White Star ships. The original strategy had been to construct 2 giant vessels, Olympic and Titanic. These 2 ships would not only offer the height of luxury for passengers on the North Atlantic, but would also provide a new standard of service for the hundreds and thousands of European emigrants on their way to America. Although not capable of matching the Cunard sisters in terms of speed, with a service speed of 21 knots, the Olympic-class ships were still fast, and would be more than capable of maintaining a respectable, comfortable, and most important of all, economic service between Southampton and New York. Ismay's cable home that day did little to conceal his delight with the company's new vessel, describing the Olympic as a marvel. But Ismay also knew that although the White Star Line was once again in the ascendant, there was little time for the company to rest on its laurels. Cunard was clearly aware of the potential of a ship of this class. They too had begun to explore the possibilities of constructing their own version. Less than a week after the launch of Titanic, the first keel plates of Cunard's Aquitania had already been laid. And with Albert Barlin's Hamburg America line also planning an even larger trio of ships, the competition was already hot. Up to this point, a third Olympic-class vessel had simply not been an option for the White Star Line. But in 3 years since Olympic and Titanic had been ordered, the commercial realities had changed dramatically. And with the public response to the Olympic being so positive, the need to build a third ship of the class in order to comfortably maintain a weekly service between Southampton and New York became greater than ever. It is against this background that Britannic was conceived. The contract for the ship's construction would not be finalised until the 23rd of October 1911. But with both of the large slipways at Belfast already occupied, there was little need to rush. In the meantime, Harland & Wolff could begin to stockpile the materials and allocate the necessary resources. But on the 28th of June 1911, exactly 1 week after the Olympic arrived at New York, the official order to proceed was given. Even before the Olympic had returned to Southampton, Ismay was considering a number of improvements to be incorporated into Titanic. The most noticeable modifications will be a larger number of cabins along the B-deck promenade. Other modifications would include a larger first-class restaurant, a veranda cafe, and an enclosed forward A-deck promenade. Throughout the summer of 1911, those modifications would be incorporated into Titanic while still fitting out at Belfast. But it would not be until the launch of the Royal Mail steamer Arlanza on the 23rd of November 1911 that the necessary space needed for the construction of a third Olympic-class liner was available. 1 week later, on the 30th of November, the keel of yard number 433 Britannic was finally laid on slip number 2 at Belfast. On the 25th of November 1911, the New York Times had picked up a story in the British press, speculating that the new ship, to be called Gigantic, would be 1,000 feet or 300 metres long and 112 feet or 34 metres wide. Intriguingly, the onboard facilities would include a cricket field, a tennis court, golf links, and even a ballroom. Although the White Star Line and the Harland and Wolff shipyards always denied it, some sources say that the ship was supposed to be named Gigantic. A copy of the Harland and Wolff order book dated October 1911, about 6 months before the Titanic disaster, already shows the name Britannic. Some handwritten changes were added to the order book and dated January 1912. These only dealt with the ship's moulded width and not her name. To this day, some persist in the belief that the ship's name was clandestinely changed because the original choice was pretentious and, in the unfortunate circumstances, also extremely embarrassing. But the documented evidence disproves this theory. While it is still possible that the name Gigantic was originally intended for the liner, the above does dispel the notion that a potential name change resulted from the Titanic disaster, as the shipyard had already listed the name as Britannic before her sister ship sank. The initial pace of work on Britannic was swift enough, with the hull being framed to the height of the double bottom by the 12th of March 1912, but already behind the scene a number of issues were beginning to materialise. In January 1912, Olympic had experienced a particularly heavy Atlantic crossing, which had highlighted serious issues in a number of the ship's riveted seams. When the vessel was dry docked at the beginning of March 1912 in order to have a propeller braid replaced, the opportunity was taken, therefore, to replace and strengthen a number of riveted seams. Furthermore, a number of small cracks were observed in the superstructure in the vicinity of some of the deck houses at the level of B-deck, and also in the area of the aft expansion joints. It was the first sign that perhaps all was not well with the design of the Olympic-class vessels. But although this was not necessarily taken to be unexpected in view of the huge technological leap that Harland and Wolff had taken, even at this stage, the learning curve in the operation of Olympic and the soon-to-be completed Titanic would result in a number of significant redesigns to Britannic. Nevertheless, even by January 1912, the evident movement and flexing in Olympic's hull, along with the evident fatigue being caused by the flexing in the top structure, was of enough concern for Britannic's engineering records to include an important modification, increasing the breadth of the vessel by 18 inches. At some later date, a further modification would also be made to Britannic's superstructure, which would incorporate 3 expansion joints instead of the 2 in Olympic and Titanic, in order to help distribute the topside flexing over as large an area as possible. But all of this was nothing as compared to what came next. Less than 2 weeks after departing from Belfast, shortly before midnight on the 14th of April 1912, RMS Titanic struck an iceberg on her maiden voyage. 2 hours and 20 minutes later, the ship disappeared beneath the surface of an unusually tranquil Atlantic Ocean, taking with her 1,503 passengers and crew. As the 712 survivors were landed at New York, the world was already hungry for answers. And the Americans would waste no time, with Joseph Bruce Ismay being called before the Senate committee inquiry being chaired by William Alden Smith, the Republican senator for Michigan. Smith acted quickly, and his report was completed less than 6 weeks after the disaster, with Lord Mersey's British report following 2 months later. Each report was strikingly different in many ways, but the overall conclusions in both were undeniable. Smith and Mersey agreed on the crucial steps that needed to be taken in order to ensure a greater safety at sea, with both recommending increased watertight subdivision and, more importantly, sufficient lifeboat capacity for everyone on board. Both the White Star Line and Harland and Wolff would be crunching numbers of their own in order to restore their battered reputations. White Star could take steps to ensure that adequate temporary lifeboat capacity could be installed on the Olympic, although that was of little benefit in the short term, as the Stokehold crew, uncertain of the safety of the additional collapsible lifeboats, mutinied on the 24th of April and declined to sail on the ship's next scheduled crossing from Southampton to New York. Unable to reach a compromise, 2 days later the voyage was cancelled and Olympic remained at Southampton until her next scheduled crossing on the 15th of May. As far as Britannic was concerned, the uncertainty was even greater, with rumours circulating that White Star would cancel the project altogether. However, the commercial realities rendered such an option unlikely. No matter how great the disaster, there was no way that White Star could maintain a balanced express service between New York and Southampton with the Oceanic and the ageing Majestic running with Olympic. On the other hand, it was also clear that wholesale alterations to certain aspects of the ship's design would need to be reconsidered. Work on yard number 433 was subsequently slowed. Britannic could be fully framed by the 27th of February 1913, approximately 50 weeks after completing the framing to the double bottom. However, considering that it had taken 46 weeks between completing the framing in Titanic's double bottom to the completion of the hull framing, in reality we are only talking a difference of about 4 weeks. Behind the scenes, however, the Harland and Wolff drawing officers were working overtime. Externally, it would take a trained eye to spot the subtle structural differences of the third, and, as it would turn out, final Olympic-class liner. But internally, Britannic would be a very different ship. An extra bulkhead was added in the electric engine room, dividing the ship into 17 compartments, as opposed to the 16 in Olympic and Titanic. But more importantly, 5 of these bulkheads now extended up as far as the bridge deck. To further add to Britannic's unsinkability credentials, a double skin would run alongside all 6 of the ship's boiler rooms, as well as the reciprocating and turbine engine rooms, for a total length of 447 feet, or 136 metres. As 1912 drifted into 1913, Britannic grew steadily on the stocks. By the 20th of September 1913, the hull was fully plated. And while structurally the ship was significantly different to the original design, at the same time much of the internal working layout of the ship would be identical to that in Olympic and Titanic. The 6 boiler rooms still contained 24 double-ended and 5 single-ended boilers, with a total of 159 furnaces. The only real difference was that in Britannic, the double-ended boilers were 1 foot longer. The engine room arrangements were also practically identical, with 2 4-cylinder inverted triple expansion reciprocating engines exhausting into a low-pressure turbine. The design of Britannic's turbine engine, however, was considerably different. The turbine in Britannic had been designed and constructed by Harland and Wolff. Whereas those in Olympic and Titanic had been built by John Brown and Company. The real difference was in their size and power. The turbine in Olympic weighed 420 tons, and could develop 16,000 horsepower, whereas the 490-ton turbine in Britannic was capable of developing 18,000 horsepower. All of this machinery combined meant that, with a total of 50,000 horsepower, Britannic was more than capable of maintaining her designed service speed of 21 knots. To the travelling public, Britannic would also incorporate the best features in Olympic and Titanic. Already mentioned was the open promenade on B deck in Olympic, which Bruce Ismay had opted to fill with additional cabins in Titanic. But Britannic's internal arrangements would essentially be a hybrid version of the two earlier ships. An open B-deck promenade would be filled with additional cabin space, including the 2 millionaires' suites, which had been incorporated into Titanic. One of the key differences further aft was the first-class restaurant, which had proved so popular in Olympic. Britannic's restaurant would stretch from the port to starboard. Whereas in Titanic and subsequently in the modified Olympic, a Café Parisien had been installed on the starboard side of B deck, in Britannic there will be no such café, with the builders instead opting for the two existing veranda cafés on the aft boat deck. As in Titanic, Britannic's forward promenade on A deck would also be enclosed with sliding windows. Other alterations in the internal arrangements included a children's playroom on the port boat deck, a hairdressing salon for the ladies next to the gentleman's barber on B deck, an additional first-class elevator amidships, and even an organ in the main first-class entrance. There was, however, one undeniable difference in the design of the three ships. Olympic and Titanic had originally been fitted with a single line of lifeboats along the forward and aft ends of the port and starboard boat decks. The loss of Titanic had highlighted the lack of lifeboat capacity, but while White Star had corrected this deficiency in Olympic by virtually enclosing the boat deck with a line of well-in lifeboat davits, in Britannic the builders had opted for an altogether different approach. There could be no doubt that safety had been made an absolute priority in Britannic, and any passenger staring at the planned 8 sets of huge lattice-girder davits would have little reason to doubt it. The February 1914 edition of Engineering magazine wrote that the davits could accommodate 48 lifeboats, although subsequent designs would indicate that the number had been reduced to 44. Pointing out that the huge size of the davits would enable them to lower the 34-foot lifeboats close to, or, if necessary due to any list, at a greater distance from the side of the ship. The stacked lifeboat arrangement on tiers at strategic areas of the boat deck also meant that the passengers could take their place in the lifeboat on the relative safety of the deck before the davits could lift the fully loaded lifeboats over the side. 2 of the boats would also be equipped with their own engines and wireless. After 27 months on the slipway, Britannic was finally ready for launching on the 26th of February 1914. This was only 1 month longer than it had taken Titanic to reach the launching stage. Continuing a long-standing White Star tradition, the occasion demanded a glittering guest list, including the company bigwigs, Admiralty officials, and local Belfast dignitaries. But for all that, there was no real launching ceremony as such. There was no White Star tradition of breaking a bottle of champagne on the ship's bow. The first rocket was fired at 11:10 a.m. to signal the workmen to knock away the few remaining blocks supporting the keel. The rocket also warned any vessels on the river to stand clear. As a second rocket was fired at 11:15 a.m, the triggers were released, and needing no assistance from the hydraulic rams, Britannic's grey-painted hull moved down the slipway. The passage made easier by over 20 tons of tallow, train oil and soft soap. "81 seconds later, having reached a speed of 9.5 knots, Britannic was afloat. Following the launch, the dignitaries retired to Belfast's Grand Central Hotel for the customary speeches and lunch. But for the shipyard workers there was no time for any such diversions. Like any other Thursday, they had a great deal of work to get done before they would be allowed home. Not least the prospect of clearing the now empty slip number 2 in preparation for Harland & Wolff's next contract, the Red Star liner Nederland. For Britannic, the immediate future involved another 6 months alongside the deep water fitting out wharf. But if everything went according to plan, then with luck she could still be in service by the late autumn. When Britannic had been launched, it was anticipated that she would enter service in September 1914. In July 1914, it was announced that Britannic would not be ready for her maiden voyage until the spring of 1915. History, however, had other plans. And during the summer of 1914, the pillars that had kept the peace in Europe for almost 100 years began to fall. On the 28th of June 1914, the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. But hostilities did not really begin until 1 month later, when Austria-Hungary invaded Serbia on the 28th of July. Great Britain had initially hoped to remain on the sidelines. But when Russia sided with Serbia, and Germany declared its support for Austria, France declared its support for Russia. And when Germany marched into neutral Belgium on the 4th of August, in violation of the Treaty of London, Britain's guarantee of Belgian neutrality left the British government with no alternative but to declare war on Germany. The impact of hostilities was no less apparent at Belfast. Harland & Wolff was not in the business of building warships, and with the majority of war materials suddenly diverted to shipyards with Admiralty contracts, there was little option but to slow the work on many civil contracts. Work on Britannic was still far enough advanced by September 1914 for the ship to be placed in the Thompson graving dock in order to have her propellers fitted. Britannic was simply not seen as priority, as there was little call for a ship of her size. The first Admiralty orders began to arrive at Belfast that October, for the conversion of a number of merchant vessels into dummy battleships. With Southampton commandeered for military use, an improvised IMM service was still maintained between Liverpool and New York, while Olympic continued to operate from the relative safety of Greenock on the Clyde. But finally she would be withdrawn from service. Her last eastbound crossing commenced on the 21st of October 1914. For security reasons, Olympic was ordered to return to Belfast on the 3rd of November. For the next 10 months, Olympic and Britannic would remain secured at Belfast, seemingly forgotten, though never totally out of mind. The simple fact, however, was that the Admiralty had no great desire to utilise the larger liners, as their deep draughts, ability to burn huge amounts of coal, and the need for such large crews to service them made them totally unsuitable. The Allied invasion of Gallipoli in April 1915 would change everything, and the sudden need for large numbers of troops to be transported to the Mediterranean meant that large vessels could no longer be overlooked. The big ships were ideally suited for the task of transporting large numbers of troops, and by June 1915, Mauretania and Aquitania had both been requisitioned for trooping duties to the Dardanelles. The large volumes of casualties also meant that within 3 months both of these vessels had been converted to hospital ships, with the result that Olympic was also requisitioned for the troop ships on the 1st of September. With the unrelenting pressure in the Mediterranean, on the 13th of November 1915, the War Office finally accepted the inevitable, and official word was received at Belfast that Britannic was urgently required for service as a hospital ship. As it happened, work on Britannic was already quite far advanced. Although by no means complete, work on the ship's wooden panelling and fittings was already well underway, even if none of the luxury furnishings had been installed. But more importantly, the mooring trials of the engines had already been completed 6 months earlier, and Harland and Wolff were confident that the ship could be made ready within 4 weeks. Externally, the ship also underwent a complete facelift, with 6 sets of Weyland davits being fitted along both sides of the boat deck, in place of the 3 of the larger sets of the girder davits that had yet to be installed. To complete the effect, the paint crews had also completely transformed the exterior, with the hull painted in the internationally recognised colours of a hospital ship: white, with a green band along the hull broken by 3 red crosses. Also, to ensure the ship's safety at night, a line of green lights ran beneath the promenade deck, while 2 electric red crosses were fitted on either side of the boat deck. By December 1915, the Admiralty Office informed the German authorities of Britannic's status as a hospital ship, and on the 8th, Britannic finally proceeded into Belfast Lock and the Irish Sea to complete her sea trials. The ship was handed over the same day. On the evening of the 11th of December 1915, over 4 years after her keel had been laid, Britannic finally departed from Belfast under the command of Captain Joseph Ranson, arriving at Liverpool's Gladstone dock the following morning. The White Star Line's original choice of commander for Britannic had been Captain Herbert James Haddock, who had commanded Olympic before the war and had distinguished himself in the attempted rescue of HMS Audacious. The Admiralty, believing Haddock was of more value in his post at Belfast, coordinating the conversion of merchant vessels into dummy battleships, were reluctant to release him from duties. And on the 14th of December, Captain Charles Alfred Bartlett officially relieved Ranson as Britannic's captain. On December the 23rd, 1915, the Britannic finally started her maiden voyage. Britannic's maiden voyage would have none of the glamour associated with those of her elder sisters. When, at 12 midnight, the ship left Liverpool for Mudros, the destination was unknown to the passengers. Rumours on board said that she was probably heading to Australia. The medical personnel took their assigned posts, and as the ship sailed to the Allied base for the Gallipoli campaign, everyone followed the routine work of a hospital ship. The hospital areas of the ship had to be disinfected, and the 3,309 beds had to be prepared in order to receive the wounded. On the 24th, the medical staff was informed that they would have only 6 days to treat the wounded, so they assumed the ship was heading to Mudros in the Mediterranean. News on board published the day's run of 426 nautical miles as Britannic passed Cape Finisterre at midday. On the 25th, Christmas Day, there was a service at 11 a.m. The day's run from 12 midday 24th to 12 midday 25th was 443 miles. Cape St. Vincent was sighted at 2 p.m. The following day, the 26th, Britannic passed Gibraltar at 1:30 a.m., sighted the Spanish coast at Cape de Gata at 10 a.m., and that morning they held a boat drill at 11:30 a.m. The day's run to midday was 455 miles. On the 27th, the Britannic passed Sardinia with a day's run of 416 miles. A concert was held in the evening. To break the monotony of the journey, on-board concerts would often be held to keep up the troops' morale. On December the 28th, the ship entered the Bay of Naples, Italy, at 8:30 a.m. in order to take enough coal and water for the non-stop return to Southampton. On the 30th, Britannic entered the Straits of Messina early morning, passing Stromboli about 5 a.m. at a speed of 20 knots. Britannic finally arrived at Mudros on the 31st of December, the last day of 1915. Patients were embarked from smaller hospital ships throughout the morning. By the morning of the 3rd of January, the last of the wounded officers had arrived from ashore, and at 3 p.m. the fully loaded Britannic left Mudros harbour and headed at full speed towards the southwest. By 9 p.m. the ship had covered 120 miles and was north of Andros with a clear run ahead for the Kea Channel. Instead of the empty wards of the previous voyage, the ship was now full of injured soldiers, and Captain Bartlett was still obliged to carry out the lifeboat drill. Shortly after 6:30 a.m. on the 5th of January, seaman Samuel L. Jones jumped overboard. According to wartime regulations, the ship couldn't stop to search for him. It was assumed he was dead. Gibraltar was passed at 10 p.m. the following evening, and once into the Atlantic, Britannic covered 506 miles in the 24-hour period up to midday on the 7th of January. 24 hours and another 512 miles later, Britannic was off Cape Finisterre, and by the evening of the 8th of January, the ship was safely through Biscay and approaching the French island of Ushant. Home was now less than a day away, and patients had their uniforms prepared for disembarkation the following morning. On the 9th of January 1916, Britannic slowly edged her way up the Solent and into Southampton water. The 6 escorting tugs, 3 forward and 3 aft, manoeuvred Britannic into the dock, and it would not be until 3 o'clock that the first of the 4,200 invalids finally began to disembark, a process that took around 8 hours. After only 11 days in port, Britannic was once again outward bound for the Mediterranean. On her second voyage, Britannic would arrive at Naples at 7 a.m. on the 25th of January, and throughout the day would take on 2,510 tons of coal and another 1,500 tons of fresh water. The intention was to sail at first light in order to arrive at Mudros at dawn on the morning of the 28th of January. But as the medical staff were settling down for the evening, a telegram arrived from the principal naval transport officer at Cairo, instructing Captain Bartlett to remain at Naples and take on the wounded patients from the hospital ship Grantully Castle, which had been redirected while en route for Mudros. In the end, Britannic's voyage to Mudros would never be completed, and the ship would remain at Naples for 11 days. Grantully Castle duly arrived alongside on the 27th of February, and that afternoon, during a 3-hour period, transferred 438 patients aboard the Britannic. An hour later, the hospital ship Formosa also began to transfer even more patients. There then followed 3 days of uncertainty before further orders were received, instructing Britannic to await the arrival of the hospital ship Essequibo, Nevasa, and Panama before returning to England. Essequibo finally arrived alongside early on the morning of the 1st of February and began transferring her 594 wounded. 24 hours later, the hospital ship Nevasa, carrying another 493 patients, also arrived. But it would not be until the morning of the 4th of February that the transfer of the remaining 319 invalids from Panama could commence. When the final transfer was completed, Britannic finally left Naples bound to Southampton, arriving back on the afternoon of the 9th of February. Britannic would remain anchored off Cowes for almost a month before finally departing for her third voyage to the Mediterranean on the 20th of March 1916. As before, there was no inkling of the final destination, although by now the medical staff were reasonably confident that it would be Naples, where indeed the ship duly arrived 5 days later. After taking on coal and water as usual, Britannic arrived at Augusta on the 28th of March. The day would be a busy one. Wounded were loaded from smaller hospital ships. On the 30th of March 1916, by 3 p.m. the transfer was complete, and Britannic was once again headed for home, arriving safely back at Southampton at 11 a.m. on the 4th of April. Britannic's future employment, however, was uncertain by this time. The unexpected Gallipoli evacuation had been massively reduced, to the point where the larger liners were suddenly no longer required. Mauretania had been released from service on the 1st of March, followed 6 weeks later by Aquitania on the 10th of April, and on the afternoon of the 11th of April, Britannic once again departed from the White Star dock and anchored off Cowes, until the Transport Division could make a decision on their last giant hospital ship. 2 weeks later, Britannic was officially released from government service, after barely 5 months in service and having completed only 3 voyages. She then returned to Belfast on the 17th of May 1916 in order to be converted into a passenger liner. But this picture would change in August 1916, when White Star was once again informed that Britannic was required for government service. By 5:40 p.m. on the 24th of September, Britannic was once again outward bound for Budros, via Naples, arriving at her destination on the 3rd of October. After 2 days, the transfer of wounded was completed, and Britannic departed for Southampton on an uneventful voyage. On the 17th of October 1916, the RAMC, Royal Army Medical Corps, had requested permission to use the Britannic for transport of medical personnel and supplies. The Admiralty approved the request. The transport of medical supplies was hardly a matter that could be regarded as illegal for a hospital ship, but subsequent observations of these activities would cause no end of problems in the coming months. The Britannic departed with some 483 extra medical personnel and many tons of extra medical supplies for Egypt, Malta, Salonika, India and Mesopotamia. Britannic arrived at Mudros at 8 a.m. on the 28th of October, and over the next 2 days she would take aboard 3,022 casualties from other hospital ships. On the 30th of November, Britannic left Mudros and reached Southampton on the 6th of November. Britannic's final visit to Southampton lasted less than a week. With Aquitania undergoing repairs and medical authorities at Mudros urgently requesting another large hospital ship to be sent out from England to evacuate more wounded, Britannic left Southampton on the early afternoon of the 12th of November. According to Captain Bartlett's official report, the ship was carrying 1,065 people, 673 crew, 315 RAMC staff, and 77 nurses. It would be her 6th voyage into the Mediterranean Sea, She passed Gibraltar around midnight on the 15th and arrived at Naples on the morning of the 17th for her usual coaling and water refuelling stop, completing the first stage of her mission. Britannic was ready for sea that same afternoon, but when a heavy storm blew up, Captain Bartlett decided to remain in harbour. By the afternoon of Sunday the 19th of November, the weather cleared just long enough for Captain Bartlett to take the opportunity to depart. The seas rose once again just as the Britannic left the port, but by next morning the storms had died and the ship passed the Strait of Messina without any problems. As the ship raced eastward towards the Aegean Sea, one of the great twists of fate in her story becomes apparent. Britannic had last arrived at Mudros on the 28th of October, on the same day that the German mine-laying submarine U-73 had been active in the Gulf of Athens. Within hours of Britannic passing through the Keir Channel that day, U-73 had laid 2 mine barriers, each consisting of 6 mines, on the Keir side of the strait. And even though Britannic had safely avoided being damaged on her return voyage, by the morning of Tuesday the 21st of November, she was steaming at full speed into the Keir Channel once again, headed straight for the danger zone, between the islands of Macronesos to her port side and the island of Keir to her starboard side. Shortly before 8 a.m, while off Angelistros Point on the island of Macronesos, Captain Bartlett ordered the course to north 48 degrees east in order to bring the ship into the Keir Channel. It was a bright and sunny morning with a calm, glass-like sea. In the lounge, the nurses were just sitting down to what would probably be their last meal before the ship was due to arrive at Mudros. Stewardess Violet Jessup, who had not only survived the loss of Titanic, but had also been aboard Olympic in September 1911 during her collision with the armoured cruiser HMS Hawke, was busy making up a breakfast tray for one of the nurses who was ill in her cabin. On the surface, everything seemed completely normal, when at 8:12 a.m. the apparent calm was shattered by the sound of a loud explosion. Which Fleming later described as if a score of plate glass windows had been smashed together. Sheila Macbeth also remembers feeling a great shudder run along the entire length of the ship, as did 15-year-old Scout George Perman, who was on duty and operating one of the ship's lifts further aft. When interviewed 83 years after the disaster, Perman could still remember the impact as if it were yesterday. When the thing struck us, or we struck it, the whole ship shuddered. That was my first recognition that something had happened. Oh, she absolutely shuddered, and immediately the cry went round, "The ship is sinking." Violet Jessup later recalled,
"There was a dull, deafening roar. Britannic gave a shiver, a long, drawn-out shudder from stem to stern, shaking the crockery on the tables, breaking things, till it slowly subsided. We all knew that she had been struck."
On the bridge at the time of the explosion were Captain Bartlett and Chief Officer Hume. Orders were immediately given to stop the ship's engines, close the watertight doors, and clear away the lifeboats. But within minutes the damage reports began to arrive on the bridge. The first reports were alarming, and the gravity of the situation soon became evident. A massive explosion had taken place low on the starboard side between holds 2 and 3. But although only 2 compartments were open to the sea, which was comfortably within Britannic's safety margin, the reality of the situation was far worse. The force of the explosion had also damaged the watertight bulkhead between hold 1 and the forepeak. That meant that the first 4 watertight compartments were filling rapidly with water. In theory, Britannic should have been able to float with anything up to 6 of her forward compartments flooded. But although only 4 were actually open to the sea, there was worse news to come. To make things worse, the fireman's tunnel connecting the fireman's quarters in the bow with boiler room 6 had also been seriously damaged, and water was flowing into that boiler room. Unfortunately, another bad surprise was waiting. For reasons unknown, the watertight doors between hold 3 and boiler rooms 6 and 5 had failed to close. Now water was flowing further aft into boiler room 5. With Britannic's situation deteriorating rapidly, Captain Bartlett ordered the remaining watertight doors closed and a distress signal to be sent, signalling that the ship had struck a mine off Port St. Nicolo. At the same time, the crew were ordered to uncover and lower the lifeboats over the side, although the order to actually release the boats was still not given. Assessing his options, Captain Bartlett realised that his best chance lay in attempting to beach the vessel on the nearby island of Keir. But a failure of the steering gear meant that he could only turn the ship by using the engines. Even so, as Britannic once again started to move, the damaged forward compartments began to fill more rapidly. To further complicate matters, the ship began to take on an increasingly noticeable list to starboard. Barely 15 minutes after the explosion, the portholes, normally 25 feet above the waterline, were already beneath the surface, and the fact that they had been opened by the medical staff earlier that morning to ventilate the lower decks of the ship was now seriously compromising Britannic's chances of survival. With the evacuation of Britannic continuing, help was already on the way. At 8:15 a.m, the destroyer HMS Courage had picked up Britannic's SOS from Port St. Nicolo. Ordering the French tugs Goliath and Polyphemus to follow, Scourge, under the command of Lieutenant Henry Tupper, immediately set course for the Keir Channel. With help fast approaching, the evacuation on board continued. Captain Harry Dyke, Britannic's assistant commander, was arranging the lowering of the boats from the aft davits on the starboard boat deck, and as custom dictated, the nurses were placed at the head of the queue. The nurses were grouped and counted into the lifeboats separately by matron E.A. Dowes, who supervised their evacuation. Assistant Commander Harry William Dyke was making arrangements for the lowering of the lifeboats from the aft davits of the starboard boat deck when he spotted a group of firemen who had taken a lifeboat from the poop deck without authority and hadn't filled it to its maximum capacity. Dyke ordered them to pick up some of the men who had already jumped into the water. The evacuation seemed to be going according to plan, but inevitably the day would be tinged with tragedy. According to 5th Officer Gordon Fielding, it was about 8:30 a.m. that 2 of the port lifeboats were lowered into the water without the authority of 3rd Officer Francis Laws, but because of the forward momentum of the ship, they were unable to get clear. Violet Jessop's account is somewhat different. She recalled that by the time she reached the boat deck, she was told that the nurses had already gone, and she could see those boats steadily drawing away from the ship, in spite of the fact that Britannic was still moving ahead. The consequences, however, were tragically similar. 2 lifeboats were unable to get clear from the ship's side and gradually drifted aft towards the Britannic's port propeller, which by now was turning above the surface. Seated in lifeboat number 4, Violet later recalled, "A few minutes after the lifeboat first touched the water, every man Jack in the group of surrounding boats took a flying leap into the sea." Although Violet had never actually learnt to swim, she quickly realised that it was now a case of either jumping into the sea and swimming for it, or suffering the same fate. In spite of her lifelong fear of drowning, she leapt overboard, the weight of her coat at first dragging her down into the depths. Then she began to feel herself rising, eventually coming up beneath one of the lifeboats, which prevented her from reaching the surface. Suddenly, there was a terrific crash as something very solid struck her on the back of her head. She instinctively reached out for something to grab hold of. After what seemed like an eternity, but in reality was probably only a few seconds, Violet once again broke the surface. Grabbing hold of a loose life jacket for support, she could finally open her eyes enough to be greeted by the sight of an unfortunate orderly, with his head split open and his brains trickling onto his khaki tunic. All around her she could see nothing but dead bodies, severed limbs, and large pieces of debris. A third boat was about to share a similar fate, but luckily the propellers stopped. As the rescue work went on, Britannic's officers continued to lower additional boats into the water, although the process was complicated by the fact that after the first boats had been successfully lowered, the forward set of port-side gantry davits had become inoperable. Concentrating on the aft set, 5th Officer Fielding was still able to launch another 3 boats, one of which was commanded by 1st Officer George Oliver, who had been ordered by Captain Bartlett to coordinate the rescue of the many swimmers in the water. By about 8:45 a.m, the increasing list to starboard had made further use of the port davits impossible, at which point the davit crews began to throw deck chairs and life rafts to the many swimmers below. Even at this stage, Captain Bartlett noticed that the ship was not sinking as fast as before, and taking advantage of this unexpected respite, at 8:45 a.m. he ordered the engines to be restarted in a final attempt to reach land. Once again, Britannic began to edge forward, but with the propellers by now working above the surface, the progress was inefficient and slow. Even so, the forward motion was still enough to force the bow deeper, and when reports began to arrive on the bridge that the water level had risen as high as D-deck, Captain Bartlett knew that it could now only be a matter of time. By this time the end was near, as the water steadily rose up over the bow, and Britannic continued to heel over. Captain Bartlett sounded a final long blast on the ship's whistle, signalling the order to abandon ship, before simply walking off the starboard wing of the bridge and into the water. It was a timely signal for Chief Engineer Robert Fleming and the remaining engineers who, like their companions on Titanic, had remained at their stations until the last possible minute, escaping via the only possible escape route left to them. Up the staircase and through the funnel casing of the 4th funnel, it actually served in part as a ventilator for the turbine engine room. As the ship continued to heel over, one by one the funnels gave way under the strain as they crashed into the water. At 9:07 a.m, only 55 minutes after the explosion, Britannic finally rolled over to starboard as her stern slipped below the surface, leaving 35 boats and hundreds of survivors in the water, scattered over the now empty Kea Channel. Northwest of Port St. Nicolo, modern Corisia, on Kea, the calm waters were full of debris, lifeboats, corpses and survivors. The crew had managed to get into the water 35 of 58 lifeboats in less than 50 minutes. Luckily, at least one of the ship's innovations proved to be crucial for the rescue of the hundreds of people who were scattered all over the area of the disaster. Within moments, the 2 motor launches rapidly picked up many survivors, as they were much faster than the non-motored lifeboats, and were also much easier to operate. The first to arrive on the scene were the Greek fishermen from Kea on their kaikia, small fishing boats, who picked up many men from the water. At 10 a.m, the Scourge sighted the first lifeboats, and 10 minutes later stopped and picked up 339 survivors. Some 150 had made it to Port St. Nicolo, where surviving doctors and nurses from the Britannic were trying to save the horribly mutilated men using aprons and pieces of lifebelts to make dressings. The Scourge and the Heroic had no deck space for more survivors, and they left for Piraeus, signalling the presence of those left at Corisia. Luckily, the Foxhound arrived at 11:45 a.m, and after sweeping the area, anchored in the small port at 1 p.m. to offer medical assistance and take on board the remaining survivors. At 2 p.m. arrived the light cruiser Foresight. The Foxhound departed for Piraeus at 2:15 p.m, while the Foresight remained to arrange the burial on Kea of Sergeant W. Sharp, who had died of his injuries. In total, 1,035 people were saved. The casualties were 30 men, 21 crew, 9 RAMC, and 38 injured, 18 crew, 20 RAMC. 2 men died on the Heroic, and one on the French tug Goliath just days before the arrival of the Britannic survivors. The nurses and the medical officers stayed in different hotels at Phaleron. The Octane Hotel was still able to accommodate 80 of Britannic's nurses, even though they had only originally expected 18. The medical staff and the wounded survivors remained in Athens until November the 27th. Then they were taken aboard HMHS Grantully Castle and departed for Malta, where they arrived on November the 30th. The group stayed there for 17 days, and there was much time to relax before finding a vessel for their return to England, the HMHS Valdivia. The voyage was very difficult because the ship was rolling too much and there were not sufficient supplies of fresh water. The situation became more critical when the order arrived to close all the portholes on the lower decks. The hospital ship finally docked at Southampton on the 26th of December. This was the final chapter in the story of the third Olympic-class liner.